You have 16 minutes.
16 minutes. Okay, well. Welcome. This is not so long, so it's great. And it's funny, so we can kind of discuss about it as I go along. It's a more kind of relaxed thing. Mythologies of Contemporary Art. This lecture is about what I see are the preconceived ideas which still affect us today in our studio as we make our work, but mostly when we try to bring it to the public. I start this by kind of bringing up two stories. The first one is that I think that if Magritte was alive today, most likely he would be working with video. I don't think he would be painting. And also another story is that I have this fantasy of this Italian painter in the 16th century who painted the Square of Malevich. So he did basically the black painting in the 16th century. He's from Hungarian origin and moved down there with his family. But you know, when he painted the black square, they thought he was crazy. So they burned the painting and they killed him and all his relatives. So today there's no proof of...
Cake?
Yeah. Chocolate cake. So there's no proof that this, that this guy made this black square painting, 400 years ago. But doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because we have no proof of it. So, and that for me, the story brings into question is, at what point does something start to exist? If he did make that painting, he told it to a friend, but it's still not recorded down in history. Does it still exist? How many people do you have to tell before something actually starts to exist? So, for me, both the Magritte and this story is just to kind of introduce that, the idea that whatever exists or whatever we do is always attached to the context, that it doesn't exist outside by itself, that it's always relevant to where it finds itself. The relation between the work and its environment. Why I became involved in making this kind of lecture and is that for years and years, I've been making work for a long time now, 15 years or something. And it's only in Amsterdam in the last 3 years that I kind of finally got my freedom to basically do as I wish kind of stuff, or that I became aware that I was just following guidelines. And then I started to ask myself, well, if for so many years I was able to produce work to the point of having shows going to Europe, without having myself in it, because I remember in my first painting class, the guy said, okay, well, just go ahead and paint. And my thoughts then was, well, I have nothing to say. And it's like for 12 years, I never had anything to say. But I was still able to produce a lot of work and to have exhibitions and to end up in Europe. So then I had to ask myself, well, how is it possible that if I was not involved in what I was doing, I was still able to function so well? And that's when I say, well, that's because there's a lot of rules and there's a lot of guidelines. And as long as you follow them, then you just end up working, And so these are these rules that I want to bring about, because these rules have nothing to do with creativity or with personality or with a kind of form of expression. For me, one of the first mythology or golden rules of art is even one step behind this belief in objectivity. Like when I was in school, when you go to art school, art history is about who did what when. So you just learn this. They don't try to get the discussion into why they were doing these kind of work in this epoch. It was more like, this is this and this is that. And it's the same thing in painting and in sculpture. In painting, there was this golden rule, which I never saw, but it was always there somehow in class, and then the teacher would come and would say, well, if we take the ruler, we compare it, it doesn't work. You know, so there was these form, colors, symmetry, and all these things. So there always had the feeling that there was this, you know, the 10th commandment of art making, to which we're always being measured to, so that there was this objectivity there. Why for me, I don't believe in any type of objectivity, that for me any experience is subjective, is by looking in how we interpret a work of art, how we come in front of it and how we look into it. And I see it as the most basic thing is you have the viewer, you have you and you have the thing in front of you. So it's basically a one-to-one, let's say, relationship. Example of why, for me, the difficulty of being objective is, let's say, you're in a classroom with a teacher present, then that will influence you in what you're going to say, as if you're alone in a museum and just thinking to yourself. Or if what you're looking at was a present from your nephew who just gave it to you. Or if it's an artist that you actually hate personally and has nothing to do with the work. So all these things, you know, having a teacher present or having not a teacher present, having to speak in front of a class as opposed to in a private, for me will bring up different evaluations of the work, different perception. The same thing as if you see a work in a museum, or you see it in the artist studio, or if you see it while you're on vacation somewhere in Spain. Again, all the context is going to affect how you're going to perceive this work. And one of the strongest example of how much it affects is you just have to look at the art of the mentally ill people. Because they are mentally ill, because they are an institution, it is not to be considered art. But that's just because they are in there. There's no other reason than that context. And that's how much the context will go and interact. And that's what for me is like, what's the outside context, of where you find yourself, the people you're with, in which kind of establishment you are. But there's also what I call the inside context, which is about how many books you've read, how much you know about art history, or philosophy, or that stuff. What kind of education you had, family, you know, were you brought up to be curious or not curious? And it's, as a fact, you know, it's impossible for all of us to have read the same book, so we don't start with the same amount of information. And an example of where that is important is like if we look, but again, Malevich, The Black Square of 1915, we'll say, wow, you know, it's amazing. And if we see one by Joel Schmo in 1960, we're just going to say, wow, you know, it's been done, it's nothing there. And if one day we find one done in 1828, we're going to think, wow, you know, this is amazing. So it has no longer to do with the work, but now it's actually in the context of history in itself. So even the evaluation will be affected by that kind of information. And at another level, you're in the classroom, if you have a hangover from last night, or if you're in a hurry to go to the toilet, or let's say you'd rather be on vacation, or you're dying for a cigarette, you know, then all these things are going to affect how you're going to talk about the work. So for me, taking all these things into account, it's very difficult for me it's actually impossible to say that two people can actually have the same perception of an object, just because of their personal relationship with the environment, the books they've read, and how they feel about themselves, or things like that. So why, if for me that is so obvious, why are we so much under this illusion, which I call an illusion, of that there's an objectivity in the world, and that everybody is using it as a ruler to compare everything? Well, if we start that, I would say that if we come basically from the same cultural background, and you have the same kind of education, family, then when you come up against the context, you will more or less see the same thing, because we were both taught to see the same thing. But when you agree on this interpretation, it's an illusion still, because that's as long as you stay on the surface. So by example, if I put a book on the table and we say, well, is it a big book or a small book? Well, more or less we will agree. Is it clean or is it dirty? But then if you start to go deeper, is it literature or is it garbage? Should we burn it or should we not burn it? Is it really, that? So as long as we just stay on the upper layers, then we'll have this illusion that there is this subjectivity, this thing we agree upon. But if actually we go further in, then it's going to be quite hard to actually come to exactly the same point. What I find problematic with that is that as long as we believe in this objectivity, then you will find yourself in a situation of evaluation where one interpretation of a person will be imposed on the other one. That's where I find this problem with believing in objectivity. So then, when two people talk about a work, I would see it more as a comparison between different ways of seeing, different ways of thinking and analyzing, but not one that is better than the other one. Because objectivity is what that situation creates. It's basically saying, because I believe in this objectivity, my opinion is better. So at that point, okay, so then everybody's equal, which is what I think is the benefit of interpretation and of exchanges. So we cannot say that one interpretation is better than another one, but we can say that something is better adapted to the context with which you want to identify. So the concept of adaptation as opposed to better is that it takes the interpretation and it contextualizes it. So an example is a car. A car is not designed for a dog or a baby to drive. So a car is adapted to the use of an adult. So you can say that the car is better suited for an adult, that they both share common elements together. So there is this. You can use this concept of adaptation of. How can I say that something is better equipped or better functions better within that context, and in that sense, when we interpret an artwork, we are actually doing the same thing. Whereas we basically, with our eyes, we're saying, well, how many correspondence do I find there in what I find here is a work of art? So basically, you're not evaluating the work of art as a thing outside there, but you're trying to find how many corresponding elements between you and the work, between your definition that you have. So you're basically looking which piece is better adapted for your use in the definition of a work of art. So then, what this means is that in your head, through art history, through your courses, through your experience, you will have learned a set of conventions, because you will have a definition of what is a work of art and what is not a work of art, because you're basically projecting out there what you have in here, trying to see what fits with what is in there. For me, the experience or the evaluation of a work of art is not as there's this thing out there totally separated from you and then you are there evaluating it. For me, there's no artwork out there. The artwork is actually the relationship that you establish with the thing. And that's a bit what I was talking about last week, about the relation between in here and out there. So that because the experience of looking at an artwork is basically you projecting on whatever's out there, does it fit as what I see as an artwork? So it's the relationship that actually creates the artwork. It's not this thing out there which possesses, you cannot say, It's not like sugar in a bowl, like art in a form. The art is actually in the relation of looking, of comparing what's there and to see if it fits with what you think about it. So then what do I find in today? What are these conventions? You know, what would be some of the biggest guidelines that we use in every day when we try to find an artwork, when we try to have what I call an art experience? Well, for me, the first mythology or convention about an artwork is that, first of all, you must just, it's the one of contemplation. Which means you walk and then you stop and you just look. You know, it's like, how many things in life do we actually do that besides TV? You know, that you actually sit and just look. So actually, the fact that you actually stop and concentrate your experience on a specific object is part of the art experience. But at this level, we still have religion, because religion is about also contemplation, or listening to music, or looking into a lover's eyes. All these, so it's still not enough, but that's the basic. You just need to stop and look at the thing. That's one of the major elements of getting an art experience. One of the second mythology is that it must have a visual body. It must be something that you can actually see, I would say touch, but you're not allowed to touch. But basically it must have a visual element to it. In the last years, the last 50 years, with conceptual and kinetic art and all these other forms of art, that has a bit expanded. But still, there must be something somewhere to which you must focus your energy to. And so that takes a lot away, like religion kind of falls away there, and music kind of falls away there. Another point that's very important is that an artwork must be shown in a place where artworks are shown. So it must be shown in a museum, or in a gallery, or it must be shown in an establishment where art is to be presented. And when that is not happening, you will notice that there will be a lot of publicity telling you that there will be art happening at that place. So if they go have a good old warehouse or any other place, airport, you know, that enormous poster telling you that art will be present at that place. Or they will put the word art as part of the form. So then you have video art, performance art, kinetic art, or art space, art site. That's also very important, that it has to be in a place where art is recognized, where it is shown. Another mythology, is that that place must also promote contemplation. So it's not enough that you kind of just stop and look, and it's not enough that it's in a space where art happens, but it must also, that's why we put in the middle of the wall, you know, to make sure you don't miss it, because if it's down there on the ground, you might just walk and not see it, you know. So, or if you just look down there, you know, we're still doing the same thing, that we must put it in a place where we're sure we won't miss it. You know, like, to the extent that, for me, if I look in a museum, well, a museum for me looks more like a sanatorium than actually an art place. Where it actually does look like a regular art place, because all signs of everyday life have been taken away. You go there and the only thing that's there is art. Sometimes there's these benches and then you're not so sure anymore if the benches are art or not. Or you got the fire hose in the wall. These can be tricky also. You know. Another very important thing about an artwork is that it cannot be anonymous. So it must always have a name attached to it somehow, somewhere. And if we don't know who made it, you're going to have a card which is going to say anonymous to it. Or school of Venetian painters, or school of Rembrandt, after the school of, you know. But an artwork must always have a name. It must always be identified. It cannot be anonymous. To the extent, and I mean that, I don't know how prevalent that is, I'm sure it's still prevalent today, but like an artwork before, 50 years ago was not finished until you had your signature on it. That's how important the identification process is, or to the point then, as well as today, you go to a gallery and get me 2 Rauschenberg and 2 Warhol, my sofa is blue. They don't even need to see the thing, as long as they have the name, then it's fine. Then they'll be happy with it. So far, for me, what I'm describing is not typical of an art world, necessarily of the art world, but it's basically the Western culture. It's basically how we are bred, or how our education is made, that we have to, everything has to be compartmented, totally defined, totally structured. Why for me this is important to talk about is because for me the action of being aware is that it gives you a choice to either do it or not, to actually work within these rules, or to actually try to find another way out. For me, it's a bit the same way that before I went to Holland, I was making painting, sculpture, and drawings because I thought that's what art was about, making painting, sculpture, and drawing. I never knew I was making them, I was just making them because that's what I had been taught. Until by myself, I kind of saw, well, actually, these are just conventions, the painting and the sculpture. And for me, it's still another step removed to say that all what I've listed so far are still very factual elements which are there, and I think that we can make a choice of either following them, or actually that if we can identify them, then we can actually try to see how this comes into our work, and to work outside of it, to see how working like that is keeping us away from some experiences, and if we actually start to move away, what other kind of field is possible. Another mythology, which I think is maybe one of the most important things, is that what you see must be official, have its letter that it's art. You must know that what is in front of you is art. If not, you won't have an art experience. So it must have its letters, its official letters. And for me, where that comes from, again, is from the education system, where you're not sent to school to think, but you're sent to school to learn what's right. And you learn also, and you don't learn right by being right, you learn right by not being wrong. And you not only learn right by being wrong, but you also learn that it's wrong to be wrong. So basically, when you go to school, basically you have the square peg and the round hole. Before you actually stepped in the school, the square peg and the round hole were already there. So they have totally nothing with you. Basically, you have to learn to put it in the right hole. And if you put it in the wrong hole, you're not being creative. You're just being wrong. And I find that this mentality, basically, that then there's a possibility of growing up, that life then becomes a slalom of avoiding being wrong all the time, as opposed to just being your own personal right or your own personal way, because we are taught constantly not to be wrong and not to think for ourselves. What conventions define intelligence? Oh, right. Wouldn't be good on TV. Also, they teach you, not to trust your senses. You shouldn't question the master. You should just kind of more or less keep quiet and just swallow everything they give to you. So they actually not only teach you that it's wrong to be wrong, but also not to trust your senses. Like curiosity killed the cat. And for me, why I talk about that and why I find that so important is that then today, when somebody goes into a museum and sees a work of art and don't feel anything for that piece, then you feel he's wrong. Because that's how he's being taught. So, because it's in a museum, and because it's being baptized as art, then it must be art. So even his own personal experience is now irrelevant, because that's the way we are being taught. You know, that when it's something is official, and following this convention, then the person there, if he doesn't understand, then he is wrong. So there's something wrong with him. So that's why I find that's also dangerous in not trusting your senses. Another important mythology is that a work of art must be useless. It cannot have any functional use. That's been the problem with crafts and with weaving. And these guys are fighting, like photo basically was in that position 150 years or even 30 years ago. And now photo is kind of semi-accepted on the equal footing as painting and sculpture. Now it's crafts who are slowly, but they're still quite functional. But so now we have like design, because if art is functional, then it becomes design. So it's not art anymore. So your artwork must be useless. It must just be there and not being able to open the can or something. And for me, one last mythology is that an artwork must be expensive. Because if it's not expensive, then it's like there's something wrong here. It doesn't fit. They don't trust, and that's a joke, but it's a real joke. If you have a print and you sell it for $30, you won't sell it. If you sell it for $300, there's more chance you will sell it because oh wow, it's worth $300. That's good. Why I kind of make a list of all these things and I bring it like that is that for me, if you fulfill all of the 8 conditions within this culture, you will be having a work of art in front of you. And that is irrelevant of who made it, what was his intention, what was his feeling, what was his personality. So if you have all these things, you will have an art experience. With no input at this point of any personal history or intentions. So for me, why are we still making it? Where's the power of attraction or interest or meaning? I mean, if it's not in this rule-following system, then what for me is then left? What's the alternative if we want to function outside of these rules? What I've before I kind of say it, I just want that I started to talk about Magritte and my Hungarian-Italian painter to see that something doesn't exist, that Magritte would be influenced by the context of where he lives today, and that this Hungarian-Italian painter is dependent on other people seeing him. So the relation between you as an artist and what is happening around you. And then to the fact to talk about objectivity and subjectivity, that was to go one step further. To say that not only are we influenced by our environment, but that how we interpret a work of art is actually attached to what we know, to what we feel, to what we think. And then all of these interpretations are equal in themselves. There's not one that is better, but they're all equal evaluations depending on our relations with it. And to the point that the actual, for me, experience of a work of art is one of actually projecting your definition or your use of a work of art on the thing itself, so that actually for me, there's actually no work of art out there. There's only the relationship between you trying to look or to identify what you need out there. So for me, it's like, instead of concentrating on this ongoing discussion about the things out there, like is this art or is this not art, for me, I think what is more, the way I should see things going or moving is that art should be viewed as a relationship and not as something outside. And the direction I would give in thinking about it, as opposed to plastering conventions on it, is that for me to try to find meaning in a work of art is in the same way as to try to find love between a mother and her child, or to find consciousness within the brain. And that for me is more, if we're busy with art, if people really want to look into it, I think that's the way it should be looked into, and not as a thing outside, but actually as a total, where the sum is more than its parts. So it's neither the thing, it's neither you, but it's actually the process happening. Thank you. That's my expose.